Okay, awesome. So we can all hear me. How is everyone? It's morning here in Australia, so I'm not quite sure where everyone else is.
Good morning. It's sort of afternoon in Hawaii at
Oh,
12:30.
you're still in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Lovely. Lovely. Okay, well, I'm really excited for today's call. I guess before jumping in, it'll be really educational, and kind of informative, and there'll be lots of opportunities for kind of open sharing and discussion as well, which will be really nice. But before diving in, I guess let's just do a check-in, take some breaths together, so that our brains are, so we're relaxed and we can kind of absorb all the information. Um, okay, so I guess just centering into our state of being, closing the eyes, and just a deep inhale through the nose and an audible exhale through the mouth. One more deep breath through the nose and an audible exhale. And one last one with a second inhale at the top of the breath. And you're just settling into where you're at right now. Just taking a moment to adjust. And when you're ready, you can come out of that relaxed state. I hope that grounded us. I feel like I really needed that. Awesome. Okay, cool. So, I guess I'll go over what we'll be covering in this call, and then I think, yeah, we'll just dive in. If anyone has any questions even before we start, that's more than welcome. Oh, Fritz wants to come in. Hi, Fritz.
Hello, hold on.
Hi. We just took some deep breaths together, but if you want to do that
Cool, will
on your
do.
own, as long as you're kind of just relaxed and ready to absorb some information.
Sounds good.
Cool. Actually, before diving into what the structure will be out, shall we do a check-in? Does everyone kind of want to go around and share how they're feeling, where they're at in the moment? I know I'll start off. I'm feeling really grateful. I'm feeling really grateful for this opportunity to be able to talk about something I'm really passionate about, and um, yeah, share information and then learn from you guys and what you guys have to share on the topic. So I'd say I'm just feeling really excited and grateful. Simon, do you want to share?
Sure. I'm doing well. I just had a little breathwork session myself and it was super deep. It was like following Christine. We did I can't remember what the title was. It was a couple of weeks back in the guided session, and that with the toning and everything, I was like super vibing with it and found how useful that was, particularly in my like sternum. So I feel like some of that excitement from there is spilling into here, being really excited to hear what you have to share. I know very little about the neuroscience of it all, so I'm super green and excited. Yeah. Thank you for the
Thank you. Amy?
Oh, I didn't realize that I wasn't on mute already. I am feeling very curious. Yeah, I think similar to Simon, there's not a lot that I've really delved into in the neuroscience of everything. So I'm just feeling very open to receive and yeah, a lot of curiosity.
We've got two Liams. Liam Dragwich.
Yes,
Okay.
I think that's the same one as me. It's just when I opened up the autopilot, it's just come up on another screen. I don't even know why it's come up that way, but we'll go with it.
Cool bananas. Cool bananas.
I also did a breath work this morning, which was very grounding, and just got to experience some inner peace and silence, which was beautiful and really got me prepared for this session and coming to see you beautiful people, delving into, knowledge that we're also passionate about. I'm also really excited so I can resonate with Simon and Amy when it comes to learning this information. I love it and I can't wait to immerse myself with you people.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you. I think are you in Victoria as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we messaged.
I need to
Also, maybe it was another Liam.
No, it was me. I think I messaged you first, and then I'm just trying to learning how to navigate the actual portal myself. So
Yeah, makes sense. Fritz, did you want to share it all?
Yeah, we'll do. It's quite late here already, so I'm probably not gonna be able to keep my eyes open for the whole 2 hours. So I'm gonna try and stay in the call as long as possible because I'm also really super keen and interested in this side of things. And I've didn't do any breath work today, but I've done a Kundalini yoga session with one of my good friends. She's just her first session in this yoga studio I go to regularly, and I've done some in September. We did like collabs, so it was super cool and interesting. I don't know if you've ever done Kundalini yoga. It's an experience, and I love it. It's like something completely different than what I usually do, and so I'm completely nicely relaxed and ready to dive in and listen. For taking the dive in and presenting some of your knowledge to us. And hi to all the rest of you, wherever you might be. I figure Australia. Liam sounds Australian. I don't know. Are you Australian?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then Amy, you said you're in the Caymans, is that correct? And Simon is in Maui. I remember when we chatted last. I'm in Mallorca, so in Europe, and the Balearic Islands next to Ibiza. And yeah, so cool. That's so nice and international.
Beautiful. Thank you, Fritz. Yeah, it's really cool. We've got like people from all over the world right now. It's awesome. All right. Well, I think, I'll just give you a bit of a rundown of what the structure of today's call will be. So we'll start off talking about the nervous system and kind of going over some basic fundamentals of the nervous system. We won't spend too much time on that because I know that that's included, like Simon and Amy, we went through quite a bit of that with our course, and Fritz as well. Liam, you will eventually learn some of the basics of the nervous system and how it works in terms of sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the way that is, relate, like knowing about the fundamentals and the physiology of our different nervous system states influences, can influence our physiology, and specifically in relation to breathwork, and how breathwork can be a tool that can kind of we can use to influence our nervous system as well. So we'll start off with that, and then we'll move into a conversation about neuroanatomy and the 3-part model of the brain. Can you guys, I'm not breaking up, am I? At all?
Just your video, your sound's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Simon. So we'll then look into the 3-part model of the brain, and that's going to, entail some neuroanatomy. We're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, and kind of our reptilian brain. And in going over that model, we'll kind of be looking at how link that into the functioning of our nervous system. And really the big takeaway in looking at the 3-part model of the brain is I'll be focusing specifically on trauma. But going to be translating everything that we talk about in that in regards to the three-part model of the brain and our nervous system, how our knowledge of that can translate into a deeper understanding of our ability to facilitate as breathwork facilitators. So how having this knowledge of the nervous system and this model of the brain that I'm going to be discussing, how we can use that in our facilitation, if that makes sense. And not only to optimize our facilitation with our clients, but to optimize different aspects of our own lives. So to not only benefit our clients, but to improve certain aspects of our own lifestyles, which then can translate into our role as facilitators, and like our efficacy as facilitators. So then I'll be linking the three-part model of the brain to, like, we'll move on then to the default mode network. And you can see how kind of like starting with the nervous system, then the three-part model of the brain, and then the default mode network, it kind of all connects. So it'll be kind of like building on knowledge throughout the discussion of those three things, which are obviously all fall under the umbrella of neuroscience. So that's why, yeah, it's very exciting. So, and in looking at the default mode network, that'll probably be the most important topic in terms of what you can draw on to optimize your facilitation. I might just change my camera, guys, just one moment. Okay, this might be a little less grainy and pixelated, but it's a bit better quality. So yeah, in talking about the default mode network, that'll probably be the area where you'd want to take the most from in terms of applicability to your role as a facilitator. And also you can definitely take some things away from it and kind of think about, oh, where is this relevant in my own life? And yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah, so does that sound good to everyone? Going over all that? Perfect. All right, I'm just going to share my screen because, okay. Okay. All right, can you guys see this? Yeah? Okay. Cool. So you guys can see the presentation and everything, just thumbs up. Okay, cool. All right, so going over what we'll cover: the nervous system, the three-part model of the brain, the default mode network. And as I said, I'm going to kind of take a bit of a perspective of looking at how we can understand these three parts of our physiology from the perspective of what happens to them when under trauma or prolonged stress. And in doing that, and this is where the relevance of these topics, this is where these topics become really relevant in relation to breathwork, is really looking at mechanisms and pathways of neuroplasticity. And ultimately, breathwork is a tool for neuroplasticity in terms of the way that it alters our nervous system, it alters the way that these three parts of our brain function, which I'll get into, and it alters the way our default mode network functions. So, and that really is like the fundamental basis of what neuroplasticity is. It's simply the way that our whole nervous system changes in response to our environment and environmental stimulus. So, and knowing that and knowing these different mechanistic pathways can help us, as I said, make our facilitation more tailored and more specialized when working with clients, depending on what they are presenting with, like what their goals are, or how they kind of their reasonings for coming to breathwork. Really knowing all of this stuff about the neurobiology of breathwork and these kinds of fundamental systems can really help us kind of understand our client more and understand how we can tailor our facilitation maybe and be a bit more sensitive to certain things, and we'll get into it. Okay, so the nervous system. The brain comprises and controls the nervous system, and it's split into two. So we have our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. Our central nervous system is just our brain and our spinal cord. And then our peripheral nervous system relates to like our senses and sensory neurons, motor neurons. It's really peripheral means like outer. And then our central nervous system is just here, like our brain. You can literally think of the central nervous system as like the functioning of the brain. And whereas the peripheral nervous system relates to like the neurons and the receptors in all the other parts of our body. And yeah, so this is kind of goes into those differences. So the peripheral nervous system is really responsible for like somatic sensations, sensory sensations, bodily functions, and it also entails the autonomic nervous system, which is again split into two, which is our sympathetic and parasympathetic states. So that's why, for example, you can see the most physiological responses when you're in a sympathetic or a parasympathetic state. There's physiological signs, right? So, and that comes down to the autonomic nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. But I guess it's kind of important to realize that the peripheral nervous system can't function without the central nervous system. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. So it's all interconnected. And yeah, so how is knowing about the nervous system relevant to working with clients? So here, emphasis should be placed on establishing presence and connection with the client in the welcome and preparation stage of our facilitation. And that kind of builds off of what I was talking about. So when someone is in a sympathetic state, for example, or let's say they're under a lot of stress, there are certain signs that kind of indicate that. They may have really tense jaw or really heightened shoulders, or I mean, you can kind of just tell in the presence of someone if they're in like a fight or flight mode, right? Or if they're, I mean, you can also kind of draw on, I'd recommend some of the content that's been posted on micro expressions and, you know, body language as well. But yeah, I think it's kind of about recognizing that every client that you have is going to be coming in and seeing you with a different nervous system state, if that makes sense. And I think recognizing that is really important. So, for example, if you have someone that comes in and they perhaps do struggle with, let's say they're under a lot of prolonged stress in relation to work or family stresses or relationship stresses, they may really benefit from more of those down-regulated regulatory breath practices. Does that make sense? So you could maybe, if you're working with them long term, or you're wanting to ease into practices with them, maybe not jump straight away into activation. You might work with them doing like box breathing, different forms of nasal breathing, if, you know, based on what they're presenting with and kind of what they're coming to you with, they're more struggling with being in that really activated state of their nervous system. Whereas recently I had a client, for example, who had fibromyalgia, and she had actually been relying on meditation, box breathing for years, right? Just to like quell her pain. And she finally got her pain under control, and she was, you know, utilizing sound therapy and all this stuff. But she actually found that her nervous system, she felt, was just in a really chronic, low-lying state. Like she struggled to really participate in exercise. She really struggled to feel alert and creative because she had been utilizing tools for so long that were really down regulating her nervous system. So she actually came to me and was like, I kind of really want to focus on these activated methods of breathing. So in that sense, you guys can see that like it's important to be aware of your client's history and what tools of breathwork they may benefit from based on, you know, where their nervous system is at. Does that make sense? Yeah, that was, I know that's a lot, but did anyone have any questions at the moment? Oh, wait, oh, there is something in the chat. Hold on.
That's for me. I just wanted to make sure we're not going into like a guided breathwork session today, right? It's like purely training and learning.
Yeah, purely sharing, learning, discussing. Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, no practicing or anything today. But I know that was like a lot to kind of put on you guys, so I feel like I'm just talking. So does anyone have any questions about that or anything that I'm kind of talking about in relation to the nervous system and peripheral, central? It's kind of complex.
So with the example that you shared, if you have a client that is in a very sympathetic state, are you saying maybe the best way to deal with them is some down regulation type breathing exercises, or should you meet them actually where they're at and then implement down regulation breathing exercises? What do you think is the best course of action?
I mean, I definitely would say take what the client, be client-centered first. So, I mean, I think what's important is just saying, I mean, and you're in this current onboarding course, hey, Liam, that's just opened up. Yeah. So what you'll learn is when you first have a client and you're kind of giving them a rundown and going really in depth in terms of what breathwork is. When you have the session with the client, you would go into talking about that there are different down regulatory methods and activated methods of breathing. So you would talk about that with the client openly, and then I would advise, yeah, being receptive to what their response is, and just being able to attune to the client and kind of not impose anything and be like, okay, well, you know, just because you're saying you struggle with anxiety, we're just not going to do activation at all. It probably takes some time of actually really talking with the client and getting to know them and what they're comfortable with, and you know, their level of their window of tolerance. And you'll learn more about that as you go through the course. But yeah, this kind of conversation is just about kind of taking in the knowledge about what different nervous system states are and how knowing what the client's experience is and what they're coming to us with, how we can kind of tailor our work with them to that. Does that make sense or answer your question?
Yeah. Just to state what you've mentioned, it's more talking them through the two nervous systems that we have, and then feeling into where they're at the moment, and then providing some solutions, which may be down regulation type breathing exercises like coherence breathing, box breathing, triangle breathing, to be able to manage their nervous system in a way where they're in control.
Yeah, giving the client autonomy and agency is definitely important in the process. And I think exactly like what you said and just verbalizing just then, that's really what, with this client that I was talking about that had fibromyalgia, I kind of wanted to be careful with guiding her into an activation because of her history of pain. Like I was quite scared that like through activation, it might reignite pain in her body somewhere. But she, after kind of going into detail with her about, the different tools of upregulation, downregulation, and the nervous system, she was already pretty like in the know. What's interesting is you might find that with clients that are already kind of pretty aware of some of the background knowledge or the basic knowledge around breathwork and things like that, or just nervous system health. And this client really was, and that's when she said to me, she was like, "Hey, Philly, like, I get that you're a bit nervous about guiding me into activation, but I really need to go into it." And it was interesting because when we were doing it, I could tell like she was definitely right in saying that she had been relying on these down regulatory states, because in it, because you know, when you're doing the method, it's like, and this particular client, I guided her through it and she was just like it was this most like mice, like a little mouse breathing. Like it was so, and I was like, is she even experiencing anything? Like what's going on? And then she came out of the experience and she was like, oh my God, I just feel like I've just run like 20 kilometers. And she was so like, she was like, I just feel like I've done a high intensity workout. I was like, really? But that was, you know, really how she felt. And she was super like happy and gave me a great testimonial and all this stuff. So yeah, I think it's just about working with the client and yeah, getting to know where they're at. So, and working together with them on that. Yes, Simon.
Some people, right, they don't have a full understanding even the words to describe their state of being and how they relate to their nervous system. And I think your example you gave with this person with fibromyalgia is like, well, she's clearly gone into quite some depths about how she regulates herself. Maybe she doesn't have I don't know if she did or didn't, but say she didn't have that language around the nervous system. I think bringing this language into a conversation just really helps regulate the space in which we're in, and then understanding that we all have like a different relationship to our nervous system. Like someone's down regulation is different to someone else's down regulation. So it's like, how do we get people to understand and feel what is their range, and then where is that point where they becomes into resistance or you know, experiencing something that's different to what they've already experienced. And yeah, just starting to sort of see the benefits of the language around it and how even that is meeting someone where they're at and trying to sort of like open their world up through language into the experience. So yeah, just thought I'd share that.
I love that, Simon. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really love that so much because especially when you do have some clients that maybe like you may encounter that aren't in touch with their body. That's very common with trauma client or people like with trauma backgrounds, is that they do struggle to be somatically kind of aware. And sometimes they don't actually establish connectivity with their nervous system and the state of their nervous system, let's say muscle tension, things like that, until you guide them through like a yoga nidra or something. And through that, you know, progressive muscle relaxation, they're finally feeling, you know, the sensations in their body that are related to their nervous system. And you're so right that really having discourse and talking with the client openly is such a beautiful way to just open the discussion, put the information out there so that they're receptive to it, and then working off that receptivity and what how they relate to what you're talking about and the kind of conclusions they can draw within themselves. And that's why, guys, the preparation stage is really so important in our facilitation, and having this open dialogue with the client. Just for their own, like psychoeducation is so important. It's such an amazing skill to have, and it's so underrated. And when you are in a group setting, or very important in group setting, but even one-on-one, yeah, really having that open discussion and informing the client and having that back and forth is really important. So yeah, so we've gone over being aware of the client's background and experience can help us better prepare and tailor the session. In alignment as well with what's awesome is that with the contraindication forms and things, maybe like an onboarding form, you might already have a rough idea of what they're coming to the table with, depending as well on like the details that you are asking in that onboarding process. So yeah, really all important to be aware of. Let's see if I can change this. Okay, cool. So what's important when it comes to breathwork is that changes occur in both our central and peripheral nervous systems when we enter into conscious breathwork. And this again is just really important for recognizing that breathwork is a versatile tool. So you don't have to just be narrowing in on activated breathing or downregulated methods of breathing. It's really a versatile tool that we can draw on at different moments and different times to really benefit us and our clients in different ways. And yeah, I was going to say something about, well, when we get into our the discussion about the 3-part model of the brain, you'll understand how changes, I mean, you guys already know, changes happen not only psychologically, and I guess in the central nervous system when you're doing activated breath work, but peripherally as well, right? Most people have experienced tetany, or pins and needles at the start of, doing sessions and things like that. So you can see that the changes that happen in the nervous system are not only felt cognitively, but also physiologically in our bodies and somatically, right? Okay, so going into the 3-part model of our brain, I know Sky's spoken about this in calls in our breathwork course. Liam, I'm not quite sure where you're up to, but this will definitely be kind of brought up, I think, when he goes into like things around the core emotions. So yeah, we've got the 3-part model of the brain basically compartmentalizes and represents a way of thinking about the way that like our brains functions, and how that has what's really cool, how that's kind of developed evolutionarily as well, which is really interesting. So we have, I guess, like the reptilian part of our brain, which says instinctual or dinosaur brain. So that's the part of our brain that we've had for millions of years. It regulates homeostasis, it regulates our temperature, it regulates our bodily functions. Super, like every mammal has it. Then we have our limbic brain, which is related to emotions and feelings. And this is what's present in a lot of mammalian species. It is very central to memory formation, our fear response, obviously, and kind of like visceral responses to our environment. And visceral in that it's very biologic in terms of like there's not a lot of rationalization in the limbic brain. But what's interesting about the limbic brain is that, as you can see, it's the second layer. So it is interconnected not only to our reptilian brain, but also our neocortex and our prefrontal, which encompasses our prefrontal cortex. And the neocortex basically is the most recently evolved and developed brain area. So monkeys, for example, like have like subtly, like it's not as developed. They have a neocortex, but it's not as developed as ours. So you have monkeys that can like play chess and partake in like things like joint attention and some activities, but it can be tested on in laboratories. But in terms of like communicating language and being able to really consolidate and form meaning out of our experiences, most species can't do that, but we can. So that's what the neocortex is. And this is just giving a little bit more detail. You don't need to remember the names of the different areas of the brain that are associated with each region. But yeah, the primal level again is comprised of our autonomic nervous system, regulating things like our blood circulatory system, our endocrine system, so our hormones, temperature, everything that kind of goes on that we're not really aware of. And then the limbic brain, or the limbic system, again, as I said, relates to our internal visceral states and responses, surrounding fear, arousal, anxiety, sexual feelings, emotions related to aggression, joy, shame. And then we have the third level, which is the neocortex, or the outer region of the brain, which is comprises of the prefrontal cortex, and it's responsible for executive functioning, perception, language, and it's basically our logical mind where we can engage in critical thinking, control, rationalization, inhibition. Yeah, Simon?
Does this overlap on the previous image with because I'm just confused with the first primal level being the reptilian brain, but then it's got
Correct.
the hypothalamus, which is part of the limbic, is it?
There's the thing is with the three-part model of the brain is it's not like it's scientifically sound, but there is overlap. Does that make sense? And that's kind of where I was going to get to with for example, there are different findings and different conclusions that are made in the literature about the hypothalamus and the hippocampus as well. The hypothalamus, are you getting confused between the hypothalamus and the hippocampus, do you think maybe?
That could be it. Yep.
Because the hypothalamus is responsible for our like endocrine functions and hormones and things like that, whereas the hippocampus, which is maybe what you're thinking of, is responsible for our memories. Is that maybe? Because the hippocampus is memories and memory retrieval, and then the hypothalamus is our hormones.
I think when it was because it's related to the hypothalamus to the endocrine system, I was associating that with the limbic system.
Yeah. Beautiful, Simon. Beautiful. Because like I love that you're forming these connections, because again, this goes to highlight, and we'll get into this further on in the slide, but the limbic system is the intermediate kind of, it's where all the richness of our emotions and the human experience happens. Yeah, Simon.
I was just waving to Fritz.
There's people in the chat. Whoopsies. Sorry, guys. Philly, thank you so much. No worries, Fritz. Love you so much. Have a wonderful sleep. Bye. Yeah, I really love, Simon, that you brought that up though, because you're right. The hypothalamus does have to do with our adrenal axis, like our adrenal axis, and but as I said, that's hormones, so that's associated with things like the release of cortisol and glucocorticoids, which are responsible for our stress response, but that works in tandem with our limbic system. Like that's what's so, like, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I was transitioning into that where the limbic system works in tandem with our primal level of our brain. And so, for example, when we are in a stressful situation and areas of the hypothalamus do activate in releasing those stress hormones, that then causes a cascade of effects on our hippocampus, on how we're retrieving information in our environment to form memories, right, in our limbic system. But that response in our limbic system is dependent on what's happening in our primal brain. Yeah. And then that influences, how our limbic system functions and responds. But then let's say that causes an overactivation of our amygdala. What does that do? That influences the way that our neocortex is responding. Because, oh my gosh, we have all these chemicals flooding our amygdala. And this goes back to neuroplasticity. So what you'll see in these situations is increased blood flow to the limbic system and the amygdala, but that means decreased blood flow to our prefrontal cortex. So that's why when we're in a blind rage, or someone goes into a blind rage, for example, their ability to rationalize and critically think, like, hey, I shouldn't be screaming at this. I shouldn't be getting into a road rage argument in traffic, because no one can control peak hour traffic. Like they can't, that area of our brain just shuts down, because all we care about is like our limbic system activating, and we're not going to be home in time to eat, and we haven't eaten all day, and that's all our instinctual system wants. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Yeah, because it perfectly highlights the interconnectivity of these three areas. Beautiful. So that's kind of going through again what each part of the brain is kind of responsible for. The model is from Dr. Paul McLean. I thought I'd put that there in case anyone wants to look into the topic more. But yeah, and then I guess, does anyone have any questions before we move forward? Any more sharing or anything? Any confusion? No? Cool. Okay, so I guess the critical thing to understand, and this is piggybacking off what me and Simon kind of were just going back and forth about, is the way that these parts of our brain function in response to our experiences in our environment. And you can see where this becomes important to recognize when we are dealing with clients or even working on ourselves in relation to traumatic experiences or times of stress or how we cope and even like how we learn. So, for example, what ways can we optimize our environment so that we can maybe encourage more activation in our prefrontal cortex, which can then increase our ability to learn and absorb information. And again, I won't get into it now, but like a lot of amazing science out there says that things like, well, breathwork, because breathwork, which we'll get into, increases blood flow to those areas in our neocortex. But meditation is a really powerful tool for influencing these three parts of our brain. But as I said, you can see that if you're someone who's gone through trauma, for example, there's massive implications. If you're someone who's gone through chronic trauma or chronic experiences of trauma, and you're having that constant activation of your limbic system, one of the mechanisms of neuroplasticity, which is really detrimental, right, is that constant increased blood flow to the amygdala. And that actually, studies have shown that people with chronic trauma histories have enlarged amygdalas. They have decreased issues associated with their stress receptors and glucocorticoid receptors. So they're less able to regulate, or they may go into a state of dissociation in a time of stress. And unfortunately as well, a lot of people with trauma actually have tangible atrophying of regions of their prefrontal cortex. So sadly, people with trauma will struggle, and unresolved trauma will struggle with things like decision making, rationalization, interpreting their environment rationally. So that's why, they might be scared or misinterpret certain things. Yeah, so it's really important to recognize that. And this next clip that I'm going to be playing, it's only about 2 minutes. It's just by this psychiatrist called Dr. Jacob Harm, and he goes into more about how we can really draw on this knowledge of the three-part brain model, and how we can think about it in terms of the human condition. It's only about 2 minutes. I'll just play it. Hopefully you guys can hear it. Can't hear it? Dang. Let's see. Maybe I need to mute myself. Can you guys hear that?
And that there's this limbic part of us that's driven by fear and survival and basic.
Okay, I'll start again.
Longer answer is that see, if we focus on trauma, then it's the wrong thing. What we should be focusing on is the way that the brain works, and that there's this limbic part of us that's driven by fear and survival and basic stuff. like food and the 4 Fs that we learned in school, and sleep and all this biological stuff. And then there's this higher self that's located in the prefrontal cortex. And those two are always battling with each other because the survival part of the brain always has precedence. It has carte blanche authority to take over. And then the prefrontal part is incredibly difficult to maintain. It takes a lot of maturation. It's the last part of the brain to develop in the early 20s for women and in the mid 20s for men. It's the first thing that gets injured. It's the first thing that gets depleted with the lack of sleep or food. Some people have argued that it's actually like a peacock's tail, that it's a display of good parenting and good resources whenever you have a great prefrontal cortex. So those two parts of us are always warring. And what trauma does is that it's like an incredibly profound driver of who wins that battle. And they've done imaging studies to show that trauma has these enormous impacts on enlarging the amygdala, on like increasing blood flow to that part of the brain, to decreasing blood flow and making parts of the prefrontal cortex atrophy. It's a trump card in terms of who wins that battle. But that's a battle that we all struggle with.
Wow. So basically, this is the human condition.
Yes.
And the degree of trauma basically is the degree to which that universal struggle has been amplified.
Yeah.
Any final message for now is fine.
Okay, so I'm also just going to go back up to my speakers. Okay, and I think that. Okay, can you guys still hear me? Okay, beautiful, beautiful. So does that kind of make sense there, in that, especially at the end there, where it's kind of important to recognize that although this system is malfunctioning in those with trauma, for example, this is something, this system, like all of our brains are neuroanatomically the same. So you can see the way that these different areas function and apply it to your own life and your own behaviors, or maybe in areas of your life where you're really reactive to certain situations and not so much in others. Or maybe looking back in retrospect, you can see, oh, wow, I can see that like my stress tolerance improved during this time when I was maybe picked up, like since starting meditating, for example. I can see, wow, I actually like, yeah, this did impact me positively in terms of my brain health and being able to learn and things like that. Let's see if I can go to the next slide. Okay. So yeah, I've kind of already gone over what happens to these parts of our brain when we're under stress. And I guess what's really important as well is that stress in small bouts is beneficial. Okay, so cortisol does give us energy, it gives us alertness, it can give us direction. But when under chronic stress from emotional, physical, or mental strain, that can cause like really like a conglomeration of really negative impacts on our health and well-being. It impacts our entire nervous system. So when you have this chronic activation of your nervous system in this way, due to what's called allostatic load, which high allostatic load basically just means like you can be someone who doesn't have trauma, but like let's say you work, like you're a parent, you work, 16-hour days, and you're doing that for like 6 months straight. Like that in and of itself, without any, you're not exercising, maybe you're not eating well, or you're not getting out in nature. Let's say you live in like a really busy city. That comes with allostatic load, and your nervous system is in a chronic state of maybe hypervigilance or stress that you may not actually be aware of. So that's really important when working with clients as well, is that a client can come to you and then maybe they don't have some crazy trauma, but instead maybe they've just entered out of a bad relationship, for example. Like heartache in and of itself and heartbreak can take such a toll and such a drain on the nervous system, but people might not actually be aware of it and aware of the physiological effects of that in terms of that emotional stress. So now I kind of just thought we might take a little break from all the information smashing. If anyone has any anything they want to share about their own experiences or any reflections they can think of about where kind of they could apply this understanding of this stuff in their own life at all. All good if you
mind if we go back to the previous slide and I can
Of course.
take down the notes? They were really good. Thank you so much.
Am I rushing too much, by the way, guys? No, okay.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
But yeah, have a think about like where you could kind of see maybe this 3-part model of the brain being applicable to having a deeper understanding of your own behaviors or the behaviors of people around you.
I think from the clip she shared where he's describing that these 2 parts of the brain that are abiding for attention and really for life, the oxygen, the blood. I know my initial reaction is one of like, oh, like how does that play out in me? How can I relate to that? Which is going to be a little bit more of a journey, but also there's an element of like, okay, this is just something that occurs, and it's something that is going to occur in everyone. So I just like coming back to balance, really.
I think what's beautiful is that, like, what is really cool in learning about this stuff is that you realize how much is out of your control. You realize like how much happens physiologically in the brain that you're not even aware of. For example, I totally nerd out on this, but for example, like the limbic system and the activation of those regions is, of course, in response to our environment. But there's actually the most, I believe it's our most sensitive receptors in relation to our limbic system is actually our olfactory bulbs, so our nose. And that's what's so incredible is like you can go out to like the shopping center or something and then walk past someone who's wearing a perfume, for example, that is like triggering of a bad memory, or maybe it's triggering of like, I mean, there are different studies that show that different pheromones can trigger, like elicit like sexual responses or feelings of attraction in people, let's say. You have no control over that. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, you had no idea that you would walk past someone that's wearing that perfume or hug someone. Like, you know, when you, like, for me, I don't know, when I like hug a guy and like, I don't know, it's so weird, but like there's something, they might not even be wearing cologne, but it's like a mixture of their cologne and their like bodily aura on their t-shirt. And it's just like, and just doing that, like, I feel like safe and protected. I don't know, but I'm just like, is this like the evolutionary part of my brain that's just like responding to this? But I have no control over that. You know what I mean? It's like biological. And that's what's really cool when you start learning about this. But then there are also certain aspects that we do have control and autonomy over. So in recognizing the way that these things work, we can be like, oh, okay, what are the ways then that I can change my behaviors to maybe, as I said, increase that activation in our prefrontal cortex. So your prefrontal cortex is always activated when you're in flow state, for example. And the flow state's a totally different kettle of fish, I think, because it's not only your prefrontal cortex, it's your prefrontal cortex is operating in certain ways with the other parts of your brain in a really unique way, but that's probably for a separate call. But yeah, it's just really, I think it's so important, Simon, how like you pointed that out, that yeah, how can it's a journey of like relating to the way that your brain functions and kind of recognizing, oh my God, how much do I actually have control over the way that I consolidate memories or anything?
Exactly. And that really got me thinking about the environment through which I choose to learn and have not chosen not chosen, but have been in a learning environment, for example, school. And I was just feeling back into like, oh yeah, there was so much going on, not only externally, but internally. Adjusting to the environment, situation, circumstances, and interactions with that all happening around me. Like actually, I've turned it into, oh, I really struggle to learn languages and anything that's to do with remembering, recall of everything. Like
Working memory and things like that. It's
yeah, because I've classically had like just not scored high. So I was just like, that's I've related to that, but just hearing and just being reminded through here of how much, like, well, first of all, the plasticity, and also I can work on it now. I can work on that now, and just how much breath work, and I'm finding now through breath work that it's sort of igniting the even more curiosity and passion around everything that's connected to that, which I feel like it's so much. And actually through having this regular practice and like, oh, I'm now looking at the way that which I am functioning, and then through the way I'm functioning, I can see how I could connect to other things and bring new tools in to help me explore and be in this playful space with it, all this information. So, which is like that buoyancy again of having everything like, okay, cool, this is excitement. Let's just put this into the arena like it's a discussion. Like here, it's far easier for me to like be in that space than because I've created the environment anyway.
yeah, and you're learning out openly, and there are so many issues with the school system that I won't get into now, but that's also what's really beautiful about learning this stuff is you can look back in retrospect on periods of your life and you can be like, oh my God, no wonder in high school I couldn't focus in doing my exams and showing up when I had this going on at home that was constantly activating my freaking amygdala. No wonder I couldn't recall information properly because my hippocampus was already overloaded with all this other traumatic shit or just different things in your environment. And that's what's so interesting too, is so beautiful, is that it's not only like socially and developmentally in our environment, but also things as weird as our physiological, like things that affect our physiology and we're not even aware of. That's why, this whole craze about morning sunlight in the morning to set your circadian rhythm, and things like, standing desks, having, not a lot of clutter, and there's so much neuroscience out there. I could ramble on for ages, but I won't. But like, there's even just subtle ways that you can enhance your learning environment that just on a physiological level make you more receptive to learning. I mean, gosh, you just like, we're drinking, like hydration, like the amount of people and the amount of kids, like diet, like just these basic fundamentals, which is why the 6 keys to living is really important. Things like hydration. If you're not properly hydrated, your brain's neurons can't fire. If you haven't got the right electrolyte balance of sodium, magnesium, potassium that's regulated by your intake of water and electrolytes, you can't really think well. You get brain fog. So it's like really cool that there are all of these different elements. So it's amazing. So thank you so much for sharing, Simon. Does anyone else have anything they want to share or ask any questions before we move on to the last part? No? Okay. These are other relevant changes of the 3-part model that are relevant to breathwork specifically. just a few things. So obviously talking about our reptilian brain, this piggybacks off well of what I was just saying, these really basic physiological changes that we can trigger, right, through engaging in something like breath work, which one of the tools that one of the mechanisms that it through which it changes our nervous system and the way our brain functions is that alteration of our CO2 and oxygen in our blood, and how that alters the pH levels. And that affects specifically our central nervous system and our spinal cord. And that explains why we have a lot of somatic sensations like pins and needles or tetany, because we're having that alteration of our blood chemistry through our hyperventilation, right? And again, as I've spoken about, you can see like hyperventilation causing these massive cascade of changes through our reptilian brain and the way that it just regulates our temperature, regulates our somatic sensations, but also you have these changes that can happen, for example, with the prefrontal cortex, just through like, let's say, conscious nostril breathing, right? And in doing that, and in doing certain patterns of breathing, you can actually increase blood flow and oxygenation to other parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex. You know, when you're engaging in mindful breathing in meditation, for example, you're not having like crazy spasms everywhere. You know what I mean? But you can see like that our breath is so connected to our nervous system in that way, and the changes that we can experience in our bodies and our minds. So as I said, like takeaway, by changing our physiology through the breath, changes occur at all three levels, can occur at all three parts of our brain and all three levels of the brain. All right, now the final area that we'll be talking about is the default mode network. And basically, this is a pattern of brain activation that occurs during states of rest, or just when you're in your day-to-day environment, just going about diddle-daddling. And it's basically a state of being where particular brain regions work together and generate thoughts, basically. During states of focus or intense flow, the DMN is deactivated, so it shuts down. So you're not in the default mode network. Default mode network is not activated during flow states, or it's activated in a very different way. Certain parts of it, certain anatomical parts of it are activated, but they're working very differently than in like your resting state. So the functions of the DMN include things like mind wandering and daydreaming, self-reflection and self-referential thoughts, recollection of past memories, planning for the future and anticipation, and social awareness and cognition surrounding one's identity, and consolidating these with experiences across one's life. So it's, again, you can see where like a lot of this kind of, all these functions kind of interconnect. It's got to do with how we ruminate day to day. So how can I kind of give an example? Like right now I'm focused, my DMN isn't activated. Right now I'm focused on giving this talk. My DMN might be activated when I'm on the train home from university and I've had a really stressful day of classes, and all I can think about is getting home and planning my assignments that I'm needing to study for. But then I'm also thinking about, oh my God, this family member, blah, blah, blah. I can't believe I had this interaction today with my teacher. Oh my gosh. And I'm just, default mode network is just like, blah, blah, blah. Does that make sense? So that's when I'm not in a flow state there. I'm not in a flow state when I'm on my way home from uni after like 7 hours of classes. I'm just like a little stress bean. And all I want to do is get home and meditate so I can down-regulate my DMN. Does that make sense to everyone?
So would you identify that as switching into unconscious thought patterns?
Spot on. Perfect, Liam. Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Absolutely perfect. So It's the way that we, you know, a lot of people before coming to breathwork, I know for me like have like unconscious beliefs and thought patterns and ideas, and maybe like as you said, we're not even conscious of it, like not even conscious to the degree that we may be negatively thinking about ourselves. But then when you like, if you were to ask someone to speak out loud what they're thinking internally about themselves, it's like, holy shit, why would, like they wouldn't say that to anyone else or think that or speak that way about anyone else. So you're so right. And that's why the DMN, and that's the thing, the DMN doesn't need to be chastised though, because it can also, as I said, just be associated with things like mind wandering and daydreaming. So like you're just, and planning. So like we'll get to it in a second, but one of the interesting things about the DMN is that it's much more interconnected and activated more consistently in females. And that makes you wonder, why do we have so many female clients? Why is this a space where we have so many like a high degree of females present? So that's really interesting too. And another, like, I'm just nerding out right now, but even from an evolutionary standpoint, you can see that when you're like when you're like out hunting, like let's say, like let's go back thousands of years, and you're a part of a tribe and you need to go out and hunt and you need to find food for your tribe, you're not in the DMN. You're like in like a flow state of just like, let's go out. And like, it's interesting. There's been studies done on this sport called orienteering, where people go out and they do orienteering with like a compass and a map, and it's like a race. And there have been studies done on those athletes and their brains, and they actually have a better like capacity to kind of like switch their DMN off, if that makes sense. And they think that's because of the repeated training and kind of ways of being that they find themselves in, where they're just focused kind of on like navigating and really drawing from these really like having their brains be in states that are just not the DMN. Like you don't really have time to be worrying about what bills you need to pay when you're trying to find your way out of some mountain range. Do you know what I mean? So it's interesting when you see like the differences, in like men and women. Men still have the activation of the DMN, obviously. But yeah, it's just really interesting stuff. So relevant information about the default mode network when working with clients is, you can see, going back to what Liam said, that the DMN is implicated in things like, and a lot of conditions like anxiety and depression, because it's involved critically in maladaptive rumination, or when someone is having ruminating thoughts about negative experiences in their life. It's just one of the key symptoms of these conditions that people struggle with. It's also... Yes, I mean.
Can you just describe what rumination is?
Yeah, of course. So rumination is kind of brooding. You could, I don't know if you know, it's like what's the word? What's a good word? Like quelling over something that happened, or negative emotions, or thinking like repetitive thoughts about something, or just like you just don't let it go. Like you don't let something go. Like let's say you had a bad interaction one morning with someone, or you've had a bad experience with this particular person at work, and you just ruminate over it. You just constantly think about it. You just think, oh my God, if only I said that, or I can't believe that John said this about me, and I can't believe like John does this, and why does John like this person more? And oh my God, it's probably because of this and this and this, and I wonder what John's problem is. But it's just like, and that's just like a constant thought pattern in your head. And then you think, oh my God, well, John doesn't like me. Well, this probably means that like Philip doesn't even like me. And what's even the point of even going to work? And God, I'm just so stupid and useless. And you can see it's just ruminating on, and it doesn't have to be just one thing. Rumination as a symptom can be in relation to a lot of things. So like past experiences, like ruminating on past trauma, and that's hard though. Like the thing is, it's hardwired. It can become hardwired in people, just based on their past experiences. Does that make sense?
Completely. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Yeah.
And so that's why, yeah, it's associated with these conditions like anxiety and depression, and also things like autism and PTSD, and that kind of goes back to, yeah, social awareness and cognition. So it's a really it's a key network in, yeah, consolidating our experiences over our lifetime with our identity and who we are now. So, and when this is malfunctioning, you can see, as Liam brought up, the way that we can have and develop false beliefs about ourselves and our identities based on our experiencing. So, as I said, the DMN is more activated in particular demographics. So it's more activated in adults, basically. And you can see why this makes sense. If you're a child, your brain's developing, you're always living in the present, everything's so amazing. Oh my God, it's a brand new day. Like, I haven't got to worry about like my DMN. What's a DMN? Like, I just want to go to the park. So it's not very active in children, and it's also not very active in like elderly people, which is an interesting finding. But it is more sensitive and interconnected and kind of like densely, yeah, complex in females, which is, as I said, really interesting. You can go into a lot of the really cool science behind why that might be. So how is knowing about the DMN relevant to working with clients? So the DMN plays a role, as I said, consolidating past emotions, past experiences with our emotions. Already went over that. But the default mode network shuts down during breathwork and altered states of consciousness. So the DMN will also shut down, yeah, as I said, in flow states, but in when you may be receiving psychedelic therapy. And this influences our experience and our state of being both during and after the session. And the way that breathwork does this specifically is through facilitating a neurological space of freedom to re-experience past traumas, memories, and emotions in a safe environment where different parts of the brain activate to rationalize these past events and maybe false beliefs or ideas one has about oneself. It interrupts, breathwork serves as a way to interrupt negative or habitual thought patterns and beliefs that one may be engaged in consciously and unconsciously. And with consistency, with consistent practice, your DMN and the way that it functions in your day-to-day life can be enhanced. So it results in you being able to reconsolidate and recondition these ideas you have about yourself and feelings in relation to past experiences, which can then change your behaviors. Because as we know, our thoughts and our emotions, our feelings, emotions and thoughts are all connected to our behaviors. So that's why with consistent practice, you can see through consistent shutting down of the DMN and then the reconsolidation that happens in breathwork and the integration process, which is so important. As I said, you've got this increased blood flow going to your prefrontal cortex regions when you're doing breathwork. So when you come back out of that, your DMN has experienced and possibly re-experienced emotions, but in a safe environment, and an environment that is conducive to creating and forming new meanings about your past experiences and the ideas of who you are, and the ideas of what you may have about yourself. Yes, Simon.
So with it, sorry if I missed it, the default network, has a physiological space in the brain? How does it connect with the three areas which you talked about at the beginning? Sorry if you're going to do that anyway.
Perfect question. I wasn't, because it's very, very it's a bit complicated, but it's the DMN is associated with the amygdala, the hippocampus, but also the anterior cingulate, which is in the reptilian brain. And I believe from memory, it's associated with the prefrontal with parts of the prefrontal cortex, but in the right hemisphere, which it's a really good question. And I wanna talk about it, but I don't want to like overcomplicate it and like scare you. It's like with too much science information, but this part of the right hemisphere that is associated with the DMM is kind of our rational brain, this most recent part of our evolutionary like development. That's where emotional processing happens, and emotional rumination. Like, so that's it's in our neocortex, but it is associated with kind of, yeah, creativity, and emotions. But when this is, what's interesting about breathwork is what you get is kind of that, because you're activating the nervous system and you're putting yourself into a fight or flight mode, your amygdala activates, but you're also activating these rational parts of your brain. And there are other parts of the DMN that are down-regulating, so they're not working in tandem. So, for example, your amygdala is no longer working with this part of your brain, which is amplifying, which usually amplifies rumination and amplifies these thoughts. Instead, your left prefrontal cortex receives more blood flow, and that allows for more logical thinking and rationalization, forming meanings. You've also got increased blood flow to the hippocampus in relation to memory retrieval. And when that is activated with this left part of your prefrontal cortex, that really is what's so key for consolidating memories properly. Because when you're someone that's traumatized and you're in a traumatic experience, what does happen is your prefrontal cortex shuts down in a lot of cases. And that can even lead to dissociation. So you're in chronic, later on when like maybe a mild trigger comes up, you can dissociate because that's your brain's visceral response. So you don't even enter into a fight or flight, you just enter into a freeze. And that's really problematic. Like that's what I struggled with, but breathwork was just a massive game changer for me in terms of being like that necessary exposure therapy in terms of activating my amygdala through activation because you're hyperventilating. So I needed that. And then that triggers the exposure of the traumatic memory or traumatic experience or unconscious feelings, right? Through that hyperventilation, because you're putting yourself back into a fight or flight mode of your body perceives as danger, but you're not, you're in a safe space, right? And you've just done down regulation before. So you're also fully in touch with your nervous system. Whereas if you're in a situation, like let's say previously where you're put into a fight or flight mode, but there's no meditation before that, before you're in that fight or something, let's say like years before, or that sexual assault, there was no down regulation. Like maybe you were completely out of touch with your body in that past experience of trauma. Okay? So that's why breathwork serves as this neurological, like I've termed it like space of freedom, where you can re-experience these past memories that have influenced your feelings and thoughts, but you're able to form new meanings and reconsolidate them because of the way that it changes the DMN when you're in that state. And with, as I said, with increased practice and consistency is where you'll see the most potent results in terms of really molding and engaging in that neuroplasticity. So the actual way that your DMN functions is better. So for me, for example, in my spare time, like I'm much like on the full transparency, on the train home from uni, I usually am not going like my state of mind usually isn't that severe of like ruminating, right? Instead, I'm thinking, just breathe. I'm going to put on a podcast that I like. Yeah, I'm feeling a bit stressed out, but I'm going to meditate when I get home. Whereas Philly from 12 months ago would have been like, like what am I going to do? I would have been like a wreck. I just wouldn't have been able to cope with the stress. But with consistent breathwork practice, another thing as well is like I've seen a massive improvement in my creativity levels. And that has to do with this more central coherence between my with my frontal lobe and my neocortex. So, and so when I'm maybe daydreaming, or let's say, like I'm in the shower, or, doing anything like the washing, folding the washing or something, my thoughts are more creative, or like you form new habits. Like there's a whole, I could definitely do like a separate call on neuroplasticity and like better ways to kind of improve creativity and things like that. But yeah, so with that, the kind of takeaway is that when the system slows down during breath work, we awaken the capacity to break habitual thought patterns. And through processes of integration following a session, we're able to reinterpret and form new meanings about these long-held narratives and beliefs that we may have about ourselves and past experiences. And yeah, implications, as I've gone over, recognizing that emotions, feelings, and thoughts are connected to our behaviors. So with that enhanced creativity, as I said, for me, I've been able to, you just see maybe habitual patterns more that you didn't before, because you have this newfound clarity, and you engage less in dysfunctional behaviors or maladaptive coping habits. And as I said, this is why the integration phase of breathwork and your facilitation is so critical, to be able to consolidate these new meanings. And these are just some studies, and I'm going to send these to you guys in like a Word document in the WhatsApp group. And there's studies that have found that voluntary hyperventilation is used in clinical settings for panic disorders and anxiety, and that's more so associated with the way that it is an exposure therapy. And then, or a second study also found that due to the alterations, mind my spelling error there, due to the alterations in the DMN, it's able to facilitate the extinction of certain behaviors, like avoidant behaviors. And I definitely have experienced that in the last 6 months since doing breathwork. Absolutely, like I've been able to change the way that, because through changing like the way that I feel, and relate to past experiences, you can just, it's hard to explain, but it's really beautiful, the transformation that can come from breathwork for clients that may have a trauma background or really struggle with anxiety or habitual tendencies and coping mechanisms that they may struggle to break. And it's through this consistent practice and utilization of breathwork as a versatile tool. So like down regulation methods, activated methods, how that can really just reap so many positive outcomes. And I think I've kind of already gone over that. Be mindful of your client's background. Yeah, the takeaway here, guys, is like through your contraindications form, through your client intake form, you can, and the information they provide is take this information that you now know about the neurobiology of breathwork and kind of just have it inform the way that you maybe enter into the session or enter facilitating, with having a greater sense of caution or sensitivity moving into the session. Yes, yeah, perfect. Bye, Amy. Thank you. We're done now, but thank you. Okay. Yeah, well, we've only got like, wait, was that Amy or Liam that went? Oh, wait. Oh, okay.
Liam just, Amy's still here, Simon's still here. Thank you for that so much for that explanation of the default mode network. It's like, oh, now I feel like I can, it's no longer an abstract concept. It's something that I, partly through the way you described it, I can sort of track that, just put it in somewhere. And yeah, is it also having examples of really clear, giving examples and following how that shows up and how that can be integrated and how part of it quietens down and part of it becomes more active. It's all these like symbols and signs and patterns start to get recognized and familiar with. So thank you. That's amazing.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much for sharing throughout as well. I love hearing from you guys. It's a shame that because I love being able to bounce off, and I feel like bounce off other people, and I feel like everyone else has so much amazing insight to offer that can really just like help enhance our understanding of these topics, and it's so enriching. So thank you as well for being here. And Amy, did you have any feedback or questions or anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to say this was wonderful. Like, you are a wealth of knowledge, and I'm excited to continue learning more from everyone in these spaces. There was a few things that I kind of wanted to go back to that I thought of when we were talking about like the senses and how they relate to your trauma when you're going through breath work. One really big thing that comes up for me is light. So I think anytime that I look back and I've gone through like very, very stressful times, or when I started to kind of fall into a depression, I was in a space where I was either in like a studio that had no access to natural light or windows, or in like a basement. And I'm very curious because obviously over time that has a big effect. If you're going day to day without enough sunlight in your day, it's going to have a really big effect on your nervous system and your health overall. But I'm curious if you would ever, in a breathwork session, essentially create an environment like that for someone to go back into those spaces where they were traumatized, right? Like, create a setting. I mean, you're having a blindfold on most of the time anyway, but like the second time that I ever did the day 2 recording, I was in my basement in Canada. So it was cold. Like, even if I took the blindfold off, there was no light at all. And now that I'm looking back on it, I definitely went through a much different experience in that breathwork session, and like brought up a lot more physically in my body in that breathwork session as compared to when I did it in Bali and there was like a sliding glass door beside me and it was like filled with light. Like, I think that when it got darker in Bali, when I was there, in my head and my space and the experience that I was going through, like sunset, but it got lighter for me in what was going on in my head. Where it's, yeah. So I'm just kind of like curious as far as the senses go, if we know enough about one of our clients and an experience that they've had, if we would try to activate like those things, trying to encourage them to come up with adjusting the environment to include some things that would activate those senses, I guess.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I mean, I guess it definitely comes back to what Sky talks about in terms of the set and the setting. And I think both of them are important in relation to your experience with contrasting the day 2 deep dive. I think taking a really holistic approach with our clients is important as well. So with regard to, the setting that you're doing it in, but also your client's background, this might sound silly, but where they are geographically, or like if I'm working with a client who lives in central Melbourne City, I know that they're in a hyperactive state and they don't get much sunlight. And almost everyone that I've met gets up at 1 p.m. and they go to bed at 1 a.m. and they all work from home and they barely get outside. So definitely taking that knowledge and your awareness of, hey, what constitutes really health and well-being, and kind of, maybe designing your breathwork space so that it is open and that there is light. That would obviously influence their experience. But it's also important, this is a bit more complex. If you're someone who lives in, let's say Canada, or a part of the world that doesn't get much sunlight, you also need to definitely take into account that the breathwork session will be influenced by, for example, your vitamin D levels. So if you haven't got vitamin D, that's related to serotonin uptake and serotonin production. Personally, I found earlier in the year when I first moved to Melbourne, it's a lot less sunny than where I'm from in Queensland. And I didn't realize how low I was in vitamin D, and I resonate with you in that I started feeling very depressed, very low mood, and that was even influencing my sessions in the morning in terms of like what emotions were coming up, how I was responding to those emotions. So definitely that's something to be mindful of and consider. That changed when I started supplementing with vitamin D during that time. But because there was just no sunlight, there was no way I could get any sunlight into my apartment. It was always raining. But in terms of altering the environment to, I guess, are you ultimately kind of inquiring about to alter the environment to kind of trigger or set the environment so that it may elicit certain emotions to come up intentionally with the client? Is that kind of where you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know necessarily that would be a good idea unless
I was going to say, I don't think so.
Very intimate
Yeah.
with the client and you like it's probably something you do in your own practice within it.
The only extent I could see it of like manipulating your session towards maybe eliciting any emotions is probably like the music. But I wouldn't go as far as being like, I'm going to intentionally make this like a dark and eerie setting so that it's a bit scary. Like I would probably, yeah, the most I would go with it again, because it's all about the client's experience and them coming and just being open to whatever unfolds. And yeah, I mean, I'm working with a client right now who I think has been feeling really like just through our pre-consultation has been feeling really lost lately. And just through talking with her, I've kind of like, and just coming across some songs recently I've been hearing on Spotify. I'm like, oh, I might make a special playlist for her. I might, that might bring up some emotion. So you could do something like that, which would be cool. That's kind of, but yeah, I wouldn't go as far as, setting any intentional kind of things, but it is important. I love that you brought it up though, because it is important to be mindful of our own environments and how that influences like things like light and being sensitive to light and sunshine and vitamin D. Again, I could do a whole other call on the way that we can influence our physiology through our diet and being mindful of certain supplements. Like, for example, for me, I've never experienced tetany because I'm very strict about my electrolytes. So it's really interesting. Different topic of conversation, but is anyone else any more questions? I know there's only two of you here, but I'm so grateful for you both being here.
One other thing that kind of got brought up in my mind when you were talking about the like orientation when people are doing like trying to find their way with a compass is, did you guys ever read the other book by James Nestor called Deep? No. Okay. Well, he goes into kind of how it's more about free diving and the breath, but he goes into research on different animals and sharks and how they have like electromagnetic portions of their brain that end up helping them with wayfinding. And technically, humans have this to a certain extent. So that's why when you brought that up, if your default mode network is shut down, I think that would give more space for people to tap into that electromagnetic ability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's so much science about our own electromagnetic field and our receptivity to shifts, and the way that we can change our state of being through things like grounding. So like spending time out in nature with your skin to skin contact on the grass, and the way that kind of static influence there can alter our magnetic like resonance. It's really, really fascinating. I probably need to dive more into it. I've only like scratched the surface, but that's so cool, isn't it? It's so cool how like, sea animals and like ocean animals can navigate their way through the oceans just through like the pulling of the Earth's magnetic field and like their sensitivity to it. And you wonder the extent to which maybe us as humans have been disconnected from that because gosh, we've got like Wi-Fi signals everywhere, phone signals, there's all this, noise, blockages, structures, concrete buildings that really influence and impact that and have probably altered our receptivity to the Earth's energy, right? Like it's really interesting to think about. So that's cool, Amy. Yeah, I love that you brought that up. And, yeah.
And I think like that is a big point too, is like your connection to nature is gonna affect it, right? Like when I'm out on a scuba dive, like normally I consider myself someone who's not really good at having a sense of direction, but I think I relate that to when I'm like stressed out in my car. When I'm on a scuba dive, like I can find my way back perfectly fine. And when I'm like snowboarding in the mountains, I can find my way back fine. But it's when you're in different situations, and I think it's because the default mode network is kicked on more, and you're starting to question yourself and starting to have like self-judgment.
That is such a beautiful connection. I love that you pulled that up. That's amazing. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Neurobiologically, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that kind of connects to what I was saying, like from an evolutionary standpoint, that yeah, males probably more frequently were out needing to navigate, needing to hunt, needing to find resources, and women were more at home worrying about planning, you know, nurturing their child, making sure that it's getting enough nutrients. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Amy. That's such a cool insight. That is so cool.
The things that I thought about when you were talking about it, because I immediately went back to when I was listening to that book, and I was like,
yeah,
that's true.
Yeah, that's so, and some people as well, I'm sure, could assert that, yeah, when they're in some of those athletes, you know, like if they are in like an orienteering race or even like an ultra marathon and they are having to like navigate the marked stations and stuff, you really do enter into kind of like a flow state where your DMN probably shuts off. And yeah, really interesting stuff. Okay, cool. So just before I end, is there any more questions or sharing? I hope that you guys were able to learn and take away a lot, and that it wasn't too much information. I know I feel like I just kind of like spoke a lot, but yeah.
Don't worry about it. That's perfect. And if you, before you have your own school and you feel you want to like go in a bit more detail into these things, some of these areas which you've taken note of, and you said there's so much more to go with. If you do want to bring into the space, like please, like feel free to. And if you want to bounce any ideas off of anyone, I'm available, and I'm sure other people are. I mean, this is just like, it's beautiful. It's great. I feel very nourished. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Simon. Yeah, if you guys have any suggestions or anything, I might put up like a post in the event section, or feel free to message me if it's something, you know, you don't want to put on the event section that you'd like me to talk about. Or yeah, definitely would be open to diving into any other topics, because yeah, as I said, my background is in psychology, so I can kind of ramble about anything science, biology, love it all. I'm such a nerd, but I do kind of as well love being able to like hear from your guys' experiences. And I'm no diver, like I'm no deep diver. So like, and it's so amazing because or even like I love these spaces because I love being able to hear from everyone's own experiences when they, you know, after they take in the information or anything, and just being able to like expand on how applicable all of this stuff is, and how we can really like learn so much more about ourselves and human behavior and our clients. And so it's really, what I love is like this open space for sharing. That's what's so awesome, is like the sharing and the exchange of dialogue. So thank you guys so much. And hopefully, oh yeah, sorry, Simon.
I was just going to jump on that, if it's talking about the ways of learning and how we can implement them, learning more about how we learn and integrate that into this space, then it's super interesting. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. I'd love that. I'd love that. And hopefully I'll see you guys on the business development call on I think it's Monday here in Australia, I think. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you all there. And thank you guys so much for being here. And yeah, I'll see you then.
Thank you.
Bye.